But in 2023, it went up to 9.7 times the annual income.
My bill just keeps going up. It doesn't matter how much I try to cut back, it's constantly going up.
You are the worst government we've ever seen.
The Australian dream is about people owning houses.
Okay, so with how much I've talked about this topic throughout my videos, I thought it'd be a good idea to go over what's been happening in other economies around the world. Today we're going to go over specifically Canada and Australia because I don't want this video to get crazy long, but I thought it would be a good idea to see what's happening in both countries because they are honestly in a worse situation than the US right now. And we have seen plenty of what's wrong around here throughout my entire channel, but maybe we'll see what might happen in the future around here because a majority of my viewers are from the US and so am I. So we're going to go over a couple of videos, see what's happening along with some comments so we could see some of the similarities and differences and maybe some foreshadowing of what might happen in the next few years in the US. So I'm going to get into it right now. We're going to start off with Canada.
Canada, which used to have the reputation as a welcoming, friendly country, is now one of the most hostile places to live in the developed world. Now, this isn't because of the people, of course, it's because of the prices.
My bill just keeps going up. It doesn't matter how much I try to cut back, it's constantly going up. And I just don't even know what to do about it.
They're ripping us off like they're ripping you off.
I feel like they're all in cahoots.
Over the past few decades, the cost of living in Canada has gone through the roof, propelled by rising costs in housing, groceries, utilities, and pretty much everything else. Meanwhile, wages have stagnated since 2006, while immigration has only increased, and it's led to a wide range of debilitating social issues, like a staggering 20% rise in homelessness since 2018. It's a process that the government has largely let happen and even encouraged in some cases, as we'll find out later. But the reality on the ground is that living in Canada is a question of survival, and for most people, these problems have massive negative impacts on how they live their lives.
And from what I see in my comment section with any Canadians who watch my videos, I have never heard a positive thing about the economy and what's happening right now. It seems like everybody is suffering there. But right off the bat, we're starting to see some similarities of what's happening in the US as well. It just seems like it's at an accelerated rate in Canada right now.
It's clear from the stats that Canadians are suffering. In the Canadian Social Survey of 2024, nearly half of the respondents said that their budgets couldn't keep up with the rising costs. Canadian household debt is another indicator of how bad it's gotten. Per citizen, it's the highest in the G7. But what really paints the picture is how Canada's Prime Minister chose to speak to his country and the response he's gotten from his fellow Canadians. Strangely, Trudeau decided that emulating bad YouTube apology videos was the best for his message on immigration. The response was, as you would expect, absolutely terrible, with around 68,000 dislikes to 22,000 likes at the time of this video. In the 7-minute long over-polished video, Trudeau covers the general basics that you'd associate with terrible apology videos. He begins by saying he'll admit his mistakes, even though he doesn't really throughout the video. Then he immediately shifts the blame to bad actors despite the fact that he implemented the policies which let it all happen.
Increasingly, bad actors like fake colleges and big chain corporations have been exploiting our immigration system for their own interests. So we're doing something major. We're reducing the numbers of immigrants that will come to Canada for the next 3 years.
It is nice to see that politics all over the place just have a general disconnect with the people they're supposed to be serving. It's not just the US. So taking one out of the Logan Paul YouTuber type playbook and making a video through YouTube being a leader of the country, it's just, I don't know how anybody in the PR team thought that that would be a good idea. But I mean, it just shows how different of a world the politics and leaders actually think compared to normal everyday people.
Like other countries close to the Arctic Circle, Canada has quite a low population compared to its massive tracts of land. But even with that relatively low population, a large chunk of those people live in a small collection of large cities, over 73% as of 2021. Canada's population and economy is therefore focused on these large cities. Toronto is the crown jewel, with a population between 6 to 8 million people depending on how you define the city. It's the centre of Canada's financial sector, and during their time in power, Trudeau's coalition government have taken advantage of this imbalance to push forward an agenda focused on benefiting the wealthy minority in control of those cities. And it's come at a massive cost to Canada's rural population, but it's also done terrible damage to Canada's urban people as well. A lot of this is because of Canada's descent into a process called financialization. As described by Canada's Centre for Housing Rights, financialization financialization is when housing transforms from something necessary for survival into a speculative financial asset. Regardless of where you live, you'll probably have seen this happen. Over the past 50 years, buying a home has gone from an achievable goal on an average salary to something that only the richest can afford. Meanwhile, investors who got involved in the housing market have seen their assets skyrocket in value. But while all of this is true, it fails to see the larger point. Financialization isn't just housing becoming a financial asset, it's the transformation of a whole society to increase the value of financial assets. Nowhere is this worse than Toronto, a city where financialization has been the cause of more than a 40% increase in home prices over the last 5 years alone. But as we'll soon find out, it's also damaged a lot more than just Toronto's housing market.
Again, how many times have you heard that online, that you have to start building a real estate portfolio, you're going to get rich? And so many people ended up doing that along with other factors. Basically across the board, if you were able to buy a house before the beginning of COVID, you are probably in a better financial situation than anybody else who's trying to buy one right now and in the past couple years. And it doesn't really seem like there's going to be a fix for it. It's only getting worse. And that branches off into other avenues. There's a lot of problems with larger corporations cutting corners. I mean, any of the shrinkflation with food just to get a little bit more profit to make their number go up on the stock market just slightly so their shareholders will be happy, and that turns into all different facets of life. And I guess that's the same thing that's happening in Canada.
So what's made it so bad in Canada specifically? Well, the book we've been discussing so far analyzes all of this in greater detail. There's a few different reasons for why Canadians have been hit especially hard. First, Canada's welcoming of foreign investment into the housing market has been disastrous. For example, a report on Vancouver and Victoria's housing markets showed that over 6 billion Canadian dollars have been laundered and invested by multinational criminal organizations.
Unbelievable.
And that figure will most likely pale in comparison to the so-called legitimate foreign investment as well. Regular people have been pushed out of their homes and barely anyone can afford to live in these cities anymore. Now to even survive in Toronto, you need to make at least $60,000 a year. Honestly, it's more like $80,000 if you actually want to own any possessions. In the other large cities, it's a little bit better, but that really isn't saying much. So why did they let all of this happen? We can give a pretty simple answer based on basic speculation. It's simply the fact that all of this has made a few powerful people filthy rich. The people who control policy are also the people who own lots of assets and benefit from skyrocketing house prices. They don't care what happens to regular people, they'll push the prices as high as they can as long as people still show up to work every day. Overall, 33% of Canadians rent, but it's much higher in the cities. In Toronto, it's 48%. Quebec City is at 49%, Vancouver's at around 55%, and in Montreal, over 60% of the residents are renting. As the rents in all of those cities have skyrocketed in recent years, wages have also stagnated. In fact, they've even gone backwards compared to inflation and the cost of living. This is a graph comparing Canada's real GDP per capita to the USA's, and it's not pretty. It's not like people in the US are having a great time, but in Canada it's been getting even worse in the past few years. Now we're at a point where the wage problem has gotten so bad that across the board, Canadians have lower salaries than people from the US.
So with all the videos that I've made, and you could look up on TikTok with everybody struggling with the cost of living, anything with cars, grocery prices, houses, really anything that you could think of, it is actually statistically worse in Canada right now. Oh man. I know that Toronto is specifically the worst place because that's the one where it seems laughable. You'll get like a little apartment and it'll be like $1 million actually. Clearly only the richest people could actually live there, or if they were lucky enough to buy so long ago that they become wealthy because of how much the value of their properties have gone up. But again, I'm just going to keep saying it over and over again, seeing some similarities with New York City, seeing it with LA, even like new booming cities like Austin that was exploding during the pandemic has priced out a lot of the people in 4 years.
This brings us right back round to Trudeau's YouTube apology about immigration and his assertion that Canada's problem is a labour shortage. This comes as an insult to people who are working as hard as they can but just aren't getting a fair deal from their country for it. Working long hours just to scrape by is easily comparable to the effects that long-term unemployment has on people. You get the same worries with it, like the stress of not knowing whether you'll make it through the next month or how far into the future you can go on for. But at the same time, you still have to work long hours every day. Wages have stagnated for years, prices are still rising, and a third of Canadian renters can't afford their rent. And it's no wonder then that so many people are slipping through the cracks when they're being squeezed this hard. Trudeau has finally announced that Canada will be limiting immigration more for the next few years at least.
We're reducing the numbers of immigrants that will come to Canada for the next 3 years.
For lots of people though, it's a little bit too late. We can be sure that the move definitely has nothing to do with his upcoming re-election campaign and his historically low approval ratings.
Of course.
For a lot of Canadians at this point, any kind of change at the top would be a welcome relief from nearly a decade of the same government. But these long-term problems aren't going to reverse themselves anytime soon, and it could be a long time before Canada can get back on its feet once again.
Magically, things only start happening politically when their job is in jeopardy. Low approval rating and the election coming up, he still wants to have that job, so that's when the gears start turning. But any other time, it just doesn't really matter, I guess. Here we can look at some of the comments from this video. What happened to Canada can only be described as controlled demolition. No way you could just coincidentally make the worst possible decisions for your company at every given opportunity for 10 years straight. A chronic shortage of labor in Canada while people can't get a job, someone is lying. Again, same issues that we've seen before. A lot of the new jobs that were magically being created month after month in the US, either first of all didn't even exist, they completely lied, and they'll revise it down to just settle the population, thinking that jobs are just growing on trees now, everything's going to be normal again. And a lot of those that actually did show up didn't pay wages nearly enough to actually survive in the country. And imagine those issues amped up even more in Canada with how difficult it is to live. I've literally never heard anyone in Canada talk about a labor shortage except the government. It's somewhat comforting to read these comments of other Canadians here. It makes me feel like less of a failure. Pretty depressing. And at least I'm not alone experiencing the crushing hopelessness. So yeah, we're definitely keeping it light in this comment section. I'm Canadian, have a great quality of life. Of course, this is after moving to Thailand. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of comments like this. And now, unfortunately, we could go across the world and see all the issues that's happening in Australia right now.
Housing affordability has sunk to its lowest level in 3 decades.
You are the worst government we've ever seen.
The Australian dream is about people owning houses.
The Australian dream is dying. This idea of encouraging people to buy a house when you're young and accumulate wealth over time has made Australians the 4th richest people on earth. But their housing market is on fire. The median cost of a house doubled from under $500,000 in 2011 to nearly $1 million in 2024, and wages didn't keep up. Australia is a massive country, roughly the size of the United States without Alaska, but they only have 5 large cities. Sydney and Melbourne account for 40% of their total population, and together with Adelaide, they're on the list of 10 least affordable cities in the world, where it costs upwards of 10 times the annual income to buy a house. So more people are looking to rent.
Every place you go, there's like 20 people lined up out the door.
It is extreme but not uncommon to see dozens of people waiting in line for inspections. This demand is one of the reasons why rents are now spinning out of control.
Our rent went up yesterday by 35%.
And of course, we saw that boom during COVID. People were waiving inspections on houses. I mean, just the stupidest decisions, the amount of demand, buying or renting places without even stepping foot in it first. But we have seen in over the past year or so that start to die down. I know in certain areas it's still pretty hot, but it's not as big of an issue as what we saw 3 years ago. But because so many people live in just a few cities in all of Australia, that's where, of course, the majority of the jobs are going to be. And when you see the house pricing doubled to almost $1 million in what was that, like 15 years, 10, 15 years? Of course, the majority of people are going to have to rent in the city. Who has that kind of money, even if you do have a nice, cushy corporate job?
The demand for rental properties is insane.
We didn't expect this situation.
The realtor made them wait for 30 minutes and judge for yourself if this apartment is worth it. On Facebook Marketplace, one landlord in Queensland was advertising single beds in shipping containers for $200 per week.
That's insane.
Another landlord offered his veranda.
So what's the deal with privacy between your sunny bedroom here and the rest of the unit?
What makes Australia's situation different is that they used to be the top of the class in terms of affordability, the percentage of people who owned their house, and they had fewer disadvantaged neighborhoods. I
mean, just renting out the veranda or just a cargo shipping container, basically, no lights or anything. It just looks like you're almost kidnapped, but you still have to pay $800 a month for that. Oh, man. And the first clip that they showed with the apartment, I mean, it didn't look ratty, like it was falling apart, but it looked completely plain. If anything, pretty tight, but you saw the line. It almost looks like the in-person tech job openings when like Apple or something like that is hiring, and they have literally hundreds and thousands of people and all dressed up nice. Everybody's got the same backpack and perfect resume, and it's for literally a couple jobs. There are many clips like that on TikTok, but it seems like it's just the same for a normal apartment in Australia.
In the 1950s, Australia was doing well. They had some of the best living standards in the world, and the economy was growing. This is when the Great Australian Dream was popularized.
Sounds familiar.
The ideal became to own a detached house on a quarter-acre block in the suburbs with a garden and a Holden, the true Australian car. The government stimulated home ownership with policies like the First Homeowner Grant. All these efforts worked. Home ownership jumped from 52% in 1950 to a peak of 71% in 1968. This happened in other countries as well, but Australia was top of the class. There was a major shift of priorities in the 1980s, from seeing housing primarily as a fundamental human right towards investing in housing for profit. The government incentivized people to buy a second home and to put this on the market to rent. This increased the number of investors on the market, increasing demand and thus raising prices.
Negative viewing of property has been super effective at making a small army of well-off Australians even richer.
It is contested to what extent these policies affected housing, but especially on the left, it is often criticized.
The reason why it's bad is that it actually gives people an incentive to take out a loan to compete with people who are buying just for a house to live in, and it massively distorts housing prices.
So it sounds like they were on the same track as us during the 50s. You know, of course, the American dream. You get the white picket fence and a family and the family dog, you know, all of that, right? In their eyes, they got a Holden. We have our big American cars back then. I mean, they were on the same page. And after a while, it started to get much harder, just like here. Now, it seems like for them, a lot of people did take that route of buying another property just to rent. Of course, the real estate stuff that you see on YouTube all the time. Maybe it's different people actually doing it. I know a lot of the problems in the US are giant conglomerates with hundreds and thousands of units just covering an entire city and owning like an unlimited amount of buildings and then just hiking the rent up every single year to a certain percentage. Everybody's just a number in the machine and being able to have somewhat of a monopoly around cities.
Interest rates dropped and dropped even further with the goal to support economic growth and to maintain inflation.
A historic drop in interest rates today, with the Reserve Bank slashing the cash rate to virtually zero.
During the pandemic, like in many other countries, they dropped to nearly zero. These extremely low rates made it easier for people to get a loan for a house, which meant that it increased demand, thus raised prices. On top of this, the government spent billions of dollars on programs that intended to help low and middle income families to buy their first house.
And it's harder for first home buyers particularly to get into the marketplace, so that $50,000, that will really help them.
This helped a lot of Australians, but it also led to more demand. And you see where I'm going with this. A lot of factors led to more demand, and this wouldn't be a problem if it was properly balanced by more supply. But that's one of the things that went wrong. The number of government-sponsored public houses that were built dropped from a peak of 20,000 in 1978 to just 3,000 in 2023. These houses are intended for people with low incomes, and they add a layer of security against homelessness. Demand for this type of housing was increasing, but government investment significantly declined.
And where have we heard that before? All the new construction that we're seeing in the US is never affordable. It's always brand new luxury condos or apartments, townhouses, big single family homes that all look the exact same. And I don't know if they have the same problem with at least the houses that are being built in Australia, but here the new construction is just absolutely abysmal. It's basically like paper houses, and you're also paying top dollar for it. It is never affordable. So going from 20,000 houses built down to 3,000, the only things that are really being put together now are going to be very expensive and basically unaffordable for most. But again, that's dialed up a little bit more because of how expensive Australia is right now.
One of Australia's challenges is that most demand is for houses near the inner cities. This is where you'll find the best job opportunities, schools, and infrastructure. But there is much local resistance.
Shame, Premier, shame! Shame, Premier, shame!
plans to build high-density housing is often met with protest.
20-story apartment towers in your streets.
They are demonstrating how we got here in the first place, why the status quo is not an option.
What homeless person can afford to pay $1 million for an apartment in Brighton? They can't.
I mean, that's basically what I just said. I know that some people just won't want the overcrowding, overpopulation in the city, which, I mean, if you live in the city, you kind of know that it's going to happen. There's just going to be more and more people coming in. It's going to get busier and busier throughout the years and decades that you live there. So it's kind of inevitable. So protesting, I don't think will really do much, but I do think what she said is accurate. If they do put in a new 20-story apartment building, none of those places are going to be cheap at all. They're going to be top dollar because they're brand new, fancy luxury construction, even though they're probably made just as poor like they are in the US.
On top of this, there are supply chain issues and a shortage of workers.
We've got shortages of labour, shortages of resources in key critical infrastructure.
These factors put together resulted in insufficient supply, thus higher prices. While all of this was going on, Australia in the past 2 years let in a record number of immigrants. It slowed significantly during the pandemic to just 25,000, but then it reached a record high with a peak in September 2023. Critics argue that this was irresponsible because it coincided with extreme difficulties in the construction sector. It was now 40% more expensive to build a home than it was before the pandemic, and supply restraints led to a building to take 18% longer to be completed. This added even more demand when supply was low, raising prices.
So I would say the percentages would be different and how expensive certain items cost in each one of these countries, but it seems like I could just erase the word Australia and put Canada there and they have the same problem, and then erase Canada and put the US and have the exact same problems. So I mean, unfortunately, even though a majority of my channel shows all the issues that Americans are having right now, this isn't just our issue, it's happening all over the world, and even worse in some areas.
The peak of record immigration coincided with 5 consecutive quarters of a shrinking GDP per capita, the longest recorded decline in Australia's history. It also coincided with a record increase of what Australians are paying for rent. This is all part of a worrying long-term trend. In 1971, these were the average house prices in Australia's main cities adjusted for inflation. By 2024, they had more than quadrupled. This is happening all around the world.
How could
but
you
in
ever
Australia,
afford
it's
that?
more extreme. In 1987, a house in Australia cost 2.8 times the annual income, similar to other countries. By 2019, this was up to 6.9 times, outpacing the US, Canada, and the UK. But in 2023, it went up to 9.7 times the annual income, the highest in the world after Hong Kong.
Okay, so we're going to go back to that chart right there. We could see what US looks like right now with all of our issues that I've gone over on this channel. Canada's even worse. UK is basically the same issues as well. New Zealand going crazy at 8.2, and then Australia at almost 10 times over. So I mean, honestly, you could say take the issues that the US are having and double it. And that's what Australia is going through right now. I have seen a lot of videos online with a lot of younger Australians in their 20s, not even trying to put roots down in Australia, just trying to save up some money and then going to another country, never even considering owning a home there because of how high the threshold is. And I mean, if this stays for a long enough period of time, you're going to have some issues down the road when there are so many of the primary generation who would be working and keeping the economy afloat just left and went to another country.
A full-time worker on a minimum wage now spends on average 68% of their income on rent. This makes it impossible to save up for a down payment on a house.
Should be like a third.
This increases the number of people that will always rent, while homeowners are becoming incredibly wealthy. The fear is that this can create a two-class society. Wealthy homeowners against disadvantaged renters.
I mean, maybe it's not as extreme here right now, but like I said earlier in the video, if you bought your house in 2019, you have a leg up compared to anybody else who's, I guess, in my position right now. I'm renting, I'm not buying a house because even where I am in North Carolina, it's getting very, very expensive.
And that perhaps nowhere else, homeownership is so intimately connected with their national identity. A recent poll asked the question, do you think owning your own home is part of the Australian way of life? And 93% answered yes. To the follow-up question, are you concerned about being able to buy a house during your lifetime? 68% answered a lot or a little.
So where have we heard that before? I guess the Australians have the same mentality like the American dream. And there's many people here right now that are completely losing hope on ever owning a house in the same way that a lot of Australians are feeling. So we could see some of the comments from this video. This is all over the Western world. This is all by design. It isn't limited to Australia. There you go. And I'm truly beginning to consider that politics worldwide are merely doing their master's bidding. I know it's turning into conspiracy theories, but it's the same issues that are happening in different countries, and the politicians, it almost seems like they're making the wrong decisions on purpose until the re-election comes and they want to keep their job, and magically everything starts to go the way it should have been years prior. Dear Australia, we have the same problem. Sign Canada. There you go. First half of the video just showed that too. You failed to mention that most, if not all, of our politicians own multiple rental properties and have no interest in fixing the situation, because if they do, they'll stop making as much money. A problem that is not talked about is foreign ownership of housing, which we saw a clip about that in Canada. It turned into money laundering, super low interest rates, so people with a lot of money could buy tons and tons of property and just hike up the rates when it got more popular. And here we go. I talked about this a couple minutes ago. As a 32-year-old Australian, I'm seriously thinking of moving overseas for the first time in my life, and I've never left Australia. Because I've said the same thing. I bet it would be cool to maybe like visit or even live in another country for like 6 months so you really get the culture, but I don't ever see myself legitimately moving out of the US, but like this person who never thought of it either, if it starts ending up getting that bad, it does start creeping in the mind of some people who would have never left and going to a place with a lower cost of living and being able to survive a lot easier there. Yeah, here's another one that's kind of upsetting. I left Australia 6 years ago, left my home, family, friends, and moved to Italy because I was lucky enough to get citizenship by blood. Sadly, to this day, I've never looked back. I earn less, but the cost of living is not suffocating. For the first time in my life, I've had savings. I have my own home. I could have never had that unless I won the lottery. So as depressing as this video is, it seems like this could be a bit of foreshadowing if things don't get better in the next few years. So let me know what you guys think, especially if you live in Canada or Australia or know anybody there. But that's all I got for you guys today. YouTube thinks you'll like this video popping up on screen right now. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, and I'll talk to you guys later.